Section 18 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, Chapter 6. But Fionn was gone, he was away, bound with his band of poets for the Galtees. It is likely they were junior poets come to the end of a year's training and returning to their own province to see again the people at home, and to be wondered at and exclaimed at as they exhibited bits of the knowledge which they had brought from the great schools. They would know tags of rhyme and tricks about learning which Fionn would hear of, and now and again, as they rested in a glade or by the brink of a river, they might try their lessons over. They might even refer to the ogham wands, on which the first words of their tasks and the opening lines of poems were cut. And it is likely that, being new to these things, they would talk of them to a youngster, and thinking that his wits could be no better than their own, they might have explained to him how ogham was written. But it is far more likely that his women guardians had already started him at those lessons. Still, this band of young bards could have been of infinite interest to Fionn, not on account of what they had learnt, but because of what they knew, all the things that he should have known as by nature: the look, the movement, the feeling of crowds, the shouldering and the intercourse of men with men, the clustering of houses and how people bow themselves in and about them, the movement of armed men, the homecoming look of wounds, tales of births, marriages and deaths, the chase with its multitudes of men and dogs, all the noise, the dust, the excitement of mere living. These, to Fionn, knew come from leaves and shadows and the dipple and dapple of a wood, would have seemed wonderful, and the tales they would have told of their masters, their looks, fads, severities, sillinesses, would have been wonderful also. That band should have chattered like a rookery. They must have been young, for one time a Leinster man came on them, a great robber named Fiachquil MacCona, and he killed the poets. He chopped them up and chopped them down. He did not leave one poetine of them all. He put them out of the world and out of life, so that they stopped being, and no one could tell where they went or what had really happened to them. And it is a wonder indeed that one can do that to anything, let alone a band. If they were not youngsters, the bold Fiachquil could not have managed them all. Or perhaps he too had a band, although the record does not say so, but kill them he did, and they died that way. Fionn saw that deed, and his blood may have been cold enough as he watched the great robber coursing the poets as a war dog rages in a flock. And when his turn came, when they were all dead and the grim red-handed man trod at him, Fionn may have shivered, but he would have shown his teeth and laid roundly on the monster with his hands. Perhaps he did that, and perhaps for that he was spared. "Who are you?" roared the staring black mouth with the red tongue squirming in it like a fresca fish. "The son of Oel, son of Pieshkina," quoth hardy Fionn, and at that the robber ceased to be a robber. The murderer disappeared. The black-rimmed chasm packed with red fish and precipices changed to something else, and the round eyes that had been popping out of their sockets and trying to bite changed also. There remained a laughing and crying and loving servant who wanted to tie himself into knots if that would please the son of his great captain. Fionn went home on the robber's shoulder, and the robber gave great snows and made great jumps and behaved like a first-rate horse. For this same Fiachquil was the husband of Bov Moll, Fionn's aunt. He had taken to the wars when Clan Pieshkina was broken, and he was at war with the world that had dared to kill his chief. End of Chapter 6. Section 19 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, Chapter 7. A new life for Fionn in the robber's den that was hidden in a vast cold marsh, a tricky place that would be with sudden exits and even suddener entrances, and with damp, winding, spidery places to hold treasure in or to hide oneself in. If the robber was a solitary, he would, for lack of someone else, have talked greatly to Fionn. He would have shown his weapons and demonstrated how he used them and with what slash he chipped his victim, and with what slice he chopped him. He would have told why a slash was enough for this man and why that man should be sliced. All men are masters when one is young, and Fionn would have found knowledge here also. He would have seen Fiaquil's great spear that had 30 rivets of Arabian gold in its socket, and that had to be kept wrapped up and tied down so that it would not kill people out of mere spitefulness. It had come from fairy, out of the she of Aileen MacMitna, and it would be brought back again later on between the same man's shoulder blades. What tales that man could tell a boy and what questions a boy could ask him. He would have known 1,000 tricks, and because our instinct is to teach, and because no man can keep a trick from a boy, he would have shown them to Fionn. There was the march too, a whole new life to be learned, a complicated, mysterious, dank, slippery, reedy, treacherous life, but with its own beauty and an allurement that could grow on one so that you could forget the solid wall and love only that which quaked and gurgled. In this place you may swim, but this sign and this you will know if it is safe to do so, said Fiaquil Macona. But in this place, with this sign on it and that, you must not venture a toe. But where Fionn would venture his toe, his ears would follow. There are coiling weeds down there, the robber consult him. There are thin, tough, snaky binders that will trip you and grip you, that will pull you and will not let you go again until you are drowned, until you are swaying and swinging away below, without stretched arms, without stretched legs, with a face all stirs and smiles and jockeyings, gripped in those leathery arms until there is no more to be gripped of you even by them. Watch this and that, Fionn would have been told, and always swim with a knife in your teeth. He lived there until his guardians found out where he was and came after him. Fiaquil gave him up to them, and he was brought home again to the woods of Slieve Bloom. But he had gathered great knowledge and new supplenesses. The sons of Mona left him alone for a long time. Having made their essay, they grew careless. "Let him be," they said. "He will come to us when the time comes." But it is likely too that they had had their own means of getting information about him. How he shaped, what muscles he had, and did he spring clean from the mark or had he to get off with a push? Fionn stayed with his guardians and hunted for them. He could run a deer down and haul it home by the reluctant skull. "Come on, go," he would say to his stag, or lifting it over a tussock with a tough flip on the snout. "Are you coming, Bold Conan? Or shall I kick you in the neck?" The time must have been nigh when he would think of taking the wolf itself by the nose, to haul it over tussocks and drag it into his pen. For he was of the breed in whom mastery is born, and who are good masters. But reports of his prowess were getting abroad. Clan Mona began to stretch itself uneasily, and one day his guardian sent him on his travels. "It is best for you to leave us now," they said to the tall stripling, "for the sons of Mona are watching again to kill you." The woods at that may have seemed haunted. A stone might sling at one from a treetop, but from which tree of 1,000 trees did it come? An arrow buzzing by one's ear would slide into the ground and quiver there silently, menacingly, hinting of the brothers it had left in the quiver behind. To the right, to the left, how many brothers, in how many quivers? Fionn was a woodsman, but he had only 2 eyes to look with, one set of feet to carry him in one sole direction. But when he was looking to the front, what, or how many watts, could be staring at him from the black? He might face in that direction, away from or towards a smile on a hidden face and a finger on a string. A lance might slide at him from this bush or from that one yonder. In the night he might have fought them. his ears against theirs, his noiseless speed against their lurking ones, his knowledge of the wood against their legion. But during the day he had no chance. Fionn went to seek his fortune, to match himself against all that might happen, and to carve a name for himself that will live while time has an ear and knows an Irishman. End of chapter 7. Section 20 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, chapter 8. Fionn went away, and now he was alone, but he was as fitted for loneliness as the crane is that haunts the solitudes and bleak wastes of the sea. For the man with a thought has a comrade, and Fionn's mind worked as fitly as his body did. To be alone was no trouble to him, who, however surrounded, was to be lonely his lifeline, for this will be said of Fionn when all is said, that all that came to him went from him, and that happiness was never his companion for more than a moment. But he was not now looking for loneliness, he was seeking the instruction of a crowd, and therefore when he met a crowd he went into it. His eyes were skilled to observe in the moving dusk and dapple of green woods. They were trained to pick out of shadows bells that were themselves dun-colored shades, and to see among trees the animals that are colored like the bark of trees. The hare crouching in the fronds was visible to him, and the fish that swayed invisibly in the sway and flicker of a green bank. He would see all that was to be seen, and he would see all that is passed by the eye that is half blind from use and want. At my life he came on lads swimming in a pool, and as he looked on them sporting in the flush tide, he thought that the tricks they performed were not hard for him, and that he could have shown them new ones. Boys must know what another boy can do, and they will match themselves against everything. They did their best under these observing eyes, and it was not long until he was invited to compete with them and show his mettle. Such an invitation is a challenge. It is almost among boys a declaration of war, but Fionn was so far beyond them in swimming that even the word master did not apply to that superiority. While he was swimming, one remarked, "He is fair and well shaped," and therefore he was called Fionn, or the Fair One. His name came from boys and will perhaps be preserved by them. He has stayed with these lads for some time, and it may be that they idolized him at first, for it is the way with boys to be astounded and enraptured by feats. But in the end, and that was inevitable, they grew jealous of the stranger. Those who had been the champion before he came would marshal each other, and by social pressure would muster all the others against him, so that in the end not a friendly eye was turned on Fionn in that assembly. For not only did he beat them at swimming, he beat their best at running and jumping, and when the sport degenerated into violence, as it was bound to, the roughness of Fionn would be 10 times as rough as the roughness of the roughest rough they could put forward. Bravery is pride when one is young, and Fionn was proud. There must have been anger in his mind as he went away, leaving that lake behind him, and those snarling and scowling boys, but there would have been disappointment also, for his desire at this time should have been towards friendliness. He went thence to Lochlein and took service with the king of Fintray. That kingdom may have been thus called from Fionn himself, and would have been known by another name when he arrived there. He hunted for the king of Fintray, and it soon grew evident that there was no hunter in his service to equal Fionn. More, there was no hunter of them all who even distantly approached him in excellence. The other ran after deer, using the speed of their legs, the noses of their dogs, and 1,000 well-worn tricks to bring them within reach, and often enough the animal escaped them. But the deer that Fionn got the track of did not get away, and it seemed even that the animal sought him, so many did he catch. The king marveled at the stories that were told of this new hunter, but as kings are greater than other people, so they are more curious, and being on the plane of excellence, they must see all that is excellently told of. The king wished to see him, and Fionn must have wondered what the king thought as that gracious lord looked on him. Whatever was thought, What the king said was as direct in utterance as it was in observation. "If Wael, the son of Fashkina, has a son," said the king, "you would surely be that son." We are not told if the king of Intrae said anything more, but we know that Fionn left his service soon afterwards. He went southwards, and was next in the employment of the king of Kerry, the same lord who had married his own mother. In that service he came to such consideration that we hear of him as playing a match of chess with the king, and by this game we know that he was still a boy in his mind, however mightily his limbs were spreading. Able as he was in sports and huntings, he was yet too young to be politic. But he remained impolitic to the end of his days, for whatever he was able to do he would do, no matter who was offended thereat, and whatever he was not able to do he would do also. That was Fionn. Once as they rested on a chase, a debate arose among the Fianna Fáin as to what was the finest music in the world. "Tell us that," said Fionn, turning to Oisin. "The cuckoo calling from the tree that is highest in the hedge," cried his merry son. "A good sound," said Fionn. "And you, Oscar?" he asked. "What is to your mind the finest music?" "The top of music is the ring of a spear on a shield," cried the stout lad. "It is a good sound," said Fionn, and the other champions told their delight. The bellowing of a stag across water, the baying of a tuneful pack heard in the distance, the song of a lark, the laugh of a gleeful girl, or the whisper of a moved one. "They are good sounds all," said Fionn. "Tell us, chief," one ventured, "what do you think?" "The music of what happens," said great Fionn. "That is the finest music in the world." He loved what happened, and would not evade it by the swerve of a hair. So on this occasion what was occurring he would have occur. Although a king was his rival and his master, it may be that his mother was watching the match and that he could not but exhibit his skill before her. He committed the enormity of winning 7 games in succession from the king himself. It is seldom indeed that a subject can beat a king at chess, and this monarch was properly amazed. "Who are you at all?" he cried, starting back from the chessboard and staring at Fionn. "I am the son of a countryman of the lineage of Tara," said Fionn. He may have blushed as he said it, for the king, possibly for the first time, was really looking at him, and was looking back through 20 years of time as he did so. The observation of a king is faultless. It is proved 1,000 times over in the tales, and this king's equipment was as royal as the next. "You are no such son," said the indignant monarch, "but you are the son that Morni, my wife, bore to Uel MacBalashna." And at that Fionn had no more to say, but his eyes may have flown to his mother and stayed there. "You cannot remain here," his stepfather continued. "I do not want you killed under my protection," he explained or complained. Perhaps it was on Fionn's account he dreaded the sons of Mona. But no one knows what Fionn thought of him, for he never thereafter spoke of his stepfather. As for Morni, she must have loved her lord, or she may have been terrified in truth of the sons of Morna, and for Fionn. But it is so also that if a woman loves her second husband, she can dislike all that reminds her of the first one. Fionn went on his travels again. End of chapter 8. Section 21 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, Chapter 9. All desires save one are fleeting, but that one lasts forever. Fionn, with all desires, had the lasting one, for he would go anywhere and forsake anything for wisdom. And it was in search of this that he went to the place where Finnegas lived on the bank of the Boyne water. But for dread of the clan Morna, he did not go as Fionn. He called himself Daemni on that journey. We get wise by asking questions, and even if these are not answered, we get wise. For a well-packed question carries its answer on its back as a snail carries its shell. Fionn asked every question he could think of, and his master, who was a poet and so an honorable man, answered them all, not to the limit of his patience, for it was limitless, but to the limit of his ability. "Why did I live on the bank of a river?" was one of these questions. "Because a poem is a revelation, and it is by the brink of running water that poetry is revealed to the mind." "How long have you been here?" was the next query. "7 years, the poet answered. "It is a long time," said wondering Fionn. "It would wait twice as long for a poem," said the inveterate bard. "Have you caught good poems?" Fionn asked him. "The poems I am fit for," said the mud master. "No person can get more than that, for a man's readiness is his limit." "Would you have got the good poems by the Shannon or the Swede or by Swede and Life?" "They are good rivers," was the answer. "They all belong to good gods." "But why did you choose this river out of all the rivers?" Finnegas beamed on his pupil. "I will tell you anything," said he, "and I will tell you that." Fionn sat at the kindly man's feet, his hands absent among tall grasses, and listening with all his ears. "A prophecy was made to me," Finnegas began. "A man of knowledge foretold that I should catch the salmon of knowledge in the boiling water." "And then?" said Fionn eagerly. "Then I would have all knowledge." "And after that?" the boy insisted. "What should there be after that?" the poet retorted. "I mean, what would you do with all knowledge?" "Obey the question," said Finnegas smilingly. "I could answer it if I had all knowledge, but not until then. What would you do, my dear?" "I would make a poem," Fionn cried. "I think too," said the poet, that is what would be done." In return for instruction, Fionn had taken over the service of his master's hut, and as he went about the household duties, drawing the water, lighting the fire, and carrying rushes from the floor and the beds, he thought over all the poets had taught him, and his mind dwelt on the rules of meter, the cunningness of words, and the need for a clean, brave mind. But in his thousand thoughts he yet remembered the salmon of knowledge as eagerly as his master did. He already venerated Finnegas for his great learning, his poetic skill, for 100 reasons. But looking on him as the ordained eater of the salmon of knowledge, he venerated him to the edge of measure. Indeed, he loved as well as venerated this master because of his unfailing kindness, his patience, his readiness to teach, and his skill in teaching. "I have learned much from you, dear master," said Fionn gratefully. "All that I have is yours if you can take it," the poet answered, "for you are entitled to all that you can take, but to no more than that. Take so with both hands. You may catch the salmon while I am with you," the hopeful boy mused. "Would not that be a great happening?" And he stared in ecstasy across the grass at those visions which a boy's mind knows. "Let us pray for that," said Finnegas fervently. "Here's a question," Fionn continued. "How does this salmon get wisdom into his flesh?" "There is a hazel bush overhanging a secret pool in a secret place. The nuts of knowledge drop from the sacred bush into the pool, and as they float, a salmon takes them in his mouth and eats them." It would be almost as easy, the boy submitted, if one were to set on the track of the sacred hazel and eat the nuts straight from the bush. "That would not be very easy," said the poet, "and yet it is not as easy as that, for the bush can only be found by its own knowledge, and that knowledge can only be got by eating the nuts, and the nuts can only be got by eating the salmon." "We must wait for the salmon," said Fionn in a rage of resignation. End of chapter 9. Section 22 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, Chapter 10. Life continued for him in a round of timeless times, wherein days and nights were uneventful and were yet filled with interest. As the day packed its load of strength into his frame, so it added its store of knowledge to his mind, and each night sealed the twain. For it is in the night that we make secure what we have gathered in the day. If he had told of these days, he would have told of a succession of meals and sleeps, and of an endless conversation, from which his mind would now and again slip away to a solitude of its own, where in large hazy atmosphere it swung and drifted and reposed. Then he would be back again, and it was a pleasure for him to catch up on the thought that was forward and recreate for it all the matter he had missed. But he could not often make these sleepy sallies. His master was too experienced a teacher to allow any such bright-faced, eager-eyed abstractions, and as the druid woman had switched his legs around a tree, so Finnegas chased his mind, demanding sense in his questions and understanding in his replies. To ask questions can become the laziest and wobbliest occupation of a mind, but when you must yourself answer the problem that you have posed, you will meditate your question with care and frame it with precision. Fion's mind learned to jump in a bumpier field than that in which he had chased rabbits, and when he had asked his question and given his own answer to it, Finnegas would take the matter up and make clear to him where the query was badly formed or at what point the answer had begun to go astray, so that Fionn came to understand by what succession a good question grows at last to a good answer. One day, not long after the conversation told of, Finnegas came to the place where Fionn was. The poet had a shallow osier basket on his arm, and on his face there was a look that was at once triumphant and gloomy. He was excited certainly, but he was sad also, and as he stood gazing on Fionn, his eyes were so kind that the boy was touched, and they were yet so melancholy that it almost made Fionn weep. "What is it, my master?" said the alarmed boy. The poet placed his osier basket on the grass. "Look in the basket, dear son," he said. Fionn looked. "There's a salmon in the basket." "It is their salmon," said Finnegas with a great sigh. Fionn leaped for delight. "I'm glad for you, master," he cried. "Indeed, I am glad for you." "And I am glad, my dear soul," the master rejoined. But having said it, he bent his brow to his hand, and for a long time he was silent and gathered into himself. "What should be done now?" Fionn demanded as he stared on the beautiful fish. Finnegas rose from where he sat by the osier basket. "I will be back in a short time," he said heavily. "While I am away, you may roast the salmon so that it will be ready against my return." "I will roast it indeed," said Fionn. The poet gazed long and earnestly on him. "You will not eat any of my salmon while I am away?" he asked. "I will not eat the littlest piece," that said Fionn. "I am sure you will not," the other murmured, as he turned and walked slowly across the grass and behind the sheltering bushes on the ridge. Fionn cooked the salmon. It was beautiful and tempting and savory as it smoked on a wooden platter among cool green leaves. And it looked all these to Finnegas when he came from behind the fringing bushes and sat in the grass outside his door. He gazed on the fish with more than his eyes. He looked on it with his heart, with his soul in his eyes, and when he turned to look on Fionn, the boy did not know whether the love that was in his eyes was for the fish or for himself. Yet he did know that a great moment had arrived for the poet. "So," said Finnegas, "you did not eat it on me after all?" "Did I not promise?" Fionn replied. "And yet," his master continued, "I went away so that you might eat the fish if you felt you had to." "Why should I want another man's fish?" said proud Fionn. "Because young people have strong desires. I thought you might have tasted it, and then you would have eaten it on me." "I did taste it by chance," Fionn laughed, "for while the fish was roasting, a great blister rose on its skin. I did not like the look of that blister, and I pressed it down with my thumb. That burned my thumb, so I popped it into my mouth. To hello, smart, if your salmon tastes as nice as my thumb did." He laughed. "It will taste very nice." "What did you say your name was, dear heart?" the poet asked. "I said my name was Dame Nee." "Your name is not Dame Nee," said the mild man. "Your name is Fionn." "That is true," the boy answered, "but I do not know how you know it." "Even if I have not eaten the salmon of knowledge, I have some small science of my own." "It is very clever to know things as you know them," Fionn replied wonderingly. What more do you know of me, dear master? I know that I did not tell you the truth, said the heavy-hearted man. What did you tell me instead of it? I told you a lie. It is not a good thing to do, Fionn admitted. What sort of a lie was a lie, master? I told you that the salmon of knowledge was to be caught by me, according to the prophecy. Yes, that was true indeed, and I have caught the fish, but I did not tell you that the salmon was not to be eaten by me, although that also was in the prophecy, and the omission was the lie. It is not a great lie, said Fionn soothingly. It must not become a greater one, the poet replied sternly. Who was the fish given to? His companion wondered. It was given to you, Finnegas answered. It was given to Fionn, the son of Uail, the son of Beishni, and it will be given to him. You shall have half of the fish, cried Fionn. I will not eat a piece of his skin that is as small as the point of his smallest bone, said the resolute and trembling bard. Let you now eat up the fish, and I shall watch you and give praise to the gods of the underworld and of the elements. Fionn then ate the salmon of knowledge, and when it had disappeared, a great jollity and tranquility and exuberance returned to the poet. Ah, said he, I had a great combat with that fish. Did it fight for its life? Fionn inquired. It did, but that was not the fight I meant. You shall eat a salmon of knowledge too, Fionn assured him. You have eaten one, cried the blithe poet, and if you make such a promise, it will be because you know. I promise it, and I know it, said Fionn. You shall eat a salmon of knowledge yet. End of chapter 10. Section 23 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, chapter 11. He had received all that he could get from Finnegas. His education was finished, and the time had come to test it, and to try all else that he had of mind and body. He bade farewell to the gentle poet, and set out for Tara of the Kings. It was Samhaintide, and the feast of Tara was being held, at which all that was wise or skillful or well born in Ireland were gathered together. This is how Tara was when Tara was. There was the High King's palace with its fortification. Without it was another fortification enclosing the 4 minor palaces, each of which was maintained by one of the 4 provincial kings. Without that again was the great banqueting hall, and around it and enclosing all of the sacred hill in its gigantic bound ran the main outer ramparts of Tara. From it, the center of Ireland, 4 great roads went north, south, east, and west, and along these roads from the top and the bottom, and the 2 sides of Ireland, there moved for weeks before Samhain an endless stream of passengers. Here a gay band went carrying rich treasure to decorate the pavilion of a monster lord. On another road a vat of seasoned yew, monstrous as a house on wheels and drawn by 100 laborious oxen, came bumping and juggling the ale that thirsty Connaught princes would drink. On a road again the learned men of Leinster, each with an idea in his hand that would discomfit a northern olive and make a southern one gape and fidget, would be marching solemnly, each by a horse that was piled high on the back and wily at the sides, with clean peeled willow or oaken wands that were carved from the top to the bottom with the Ogham signs. The first lines of poems, for it was an offense against wisdom to commit more than initial lines unto writing, the names and dates of kings, the procession of laws of Tara and of the sub-kingdoms, the names of places and their meanings. On the brown stallion ambling peacefully yonder, there might go the warring of the gods for 2 or 10,000 years. This mare with the dainty pace and the vicious eye might be sidling under a load of oaken oats in honor of her owner's family, with a few bundles of tales of wonder added in case they might be useful, and perhaps the restive piebald was backing the history of Ireland into a ditch. On such a journey all people spoke together, for all were friends, and no person regarded the weapon in another man's hands other than as an implement to poke a reluctant cow with, or to pacify with loud wallops some hoof-proud colt. Into this teem and profusion of jolly humanity Fionn slipped, and if his mood had been as bellicose as a wounded boar, he would yet have found no man to quarrel with, and if his eyes had been as sharp as a jealous husband's, he would have found no eye to meet it with calculation, or menace, or fear. For the peace of Ireland was in being, and for 6 weeks man was neighbour to man, and the nation was the guest of the High King. Fionn went in with the notables. His arrival had been timed for the opening day and the great feast of welcome. He may have marvelled, looking on the bright city with its pillars of gleaming bronze and the roofs that were painted in many colors, so that each house seemed to be covered by the spreading wings of some gigantic and gorgeous bird. But the palaces themselves, mellow with red oak, polished within and without by the wear and the care of 1,000 years, and carved with the patient skill of unending generations of the most famous artists of the most artistic country of the Western world, would have given him much to marvel at also. It must have seemed like a city of dream, a city to catch the heart, when coming over the great plain, Fionn saw Tara of the kings, held on its hill as in a hand to gather all the gold of the falling sun, and to restore a brightness as mellow and tender as that universal largesse. In the great banqueting hall everything was in order for the feast. The nobles of Ireland with their winsome consorts, the learned and artistic professions represented by the peak of their time, were in place. The ard-ri, Corm of the 100 Battles, had taken his place on the raised dais which commanded the whole of that vast hall. At his right hand his son Art, to be afterwards as famous as his famous father, took his seat, and on his left Goldmore MacMorna, chief of the Fianna of Ireland, had the seat of honour. As the High King took his place, he could see every person who was noted in the land for any reason. He would know everyone who was present, for the fame of all men is sealed at Tara, and behind his chair a herald stood to tell anything the king might not know or had forgotten. Some gave the signal, and his guests seated themselves. The time had come for the squires to take their stations behind their masters and mistresses, but for the moment the great room was seated, and the doors were held to allow a moment of respect to pass before the servers and squires came in. Looking over his guests, Conn observed that the young man was yet standing. "There is a gentleman," he murmured, "for whom no seat had been found." We may be sure that the master of banquet blushed at that. "And," the king continued, "I do not seem to know the young man." Nor did his herald, nor did the unfortunate master, nor did anybody, for the eyes of all were now turned where the kings went. "Give me my horn," said the gracious monarch. The horn of state was put to his hand. "Young gentleman," he called to the stranger, "I wish to drink to your health and to welcome you to Tara." The young man came forward then, greater shouldered than any mighty man of that gathering, longer and cleaner limbed, with his fair curls dancing about his beardless face. The king put the great horn into his hand. "Tell me your name," he commanded gently. "I am Fionn, the son of Wael, the son of Beshkni," said the youth. And at that saying a touch as of lightning went through the gathering, so that each person quivered, and the son of the great murdered captain looked by the king's shoulder into the twinkling eye of gold. But no word was uttered, no movement made except the movement and the utterance of the ard-ri. "You are the son of a friend," said the great-hearted monarch. "You shall have the seat of a friend." He placed Fionn at the right hand of his own son Art. End of chapter 11. Section 24 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn. Chapter 12. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Chapter 12. It is to be known that on the night of the Feast of Samhain, the doors separating this world and the next one are opened, and the inhabitants of either world can leave their respective spheres and appear in the world of the other beings. Now there was a grandson to the Dagdamer, the lord of the underworld, and he was named Aelin Macmedna, out of She Fineki, and this Aelin bore an implacable enmity to Tara and Ardri. As well as being monarch of Ireland, her high king was chief of the people, learned in magic, and it is possible that at some time Conn had adventured into Ternanog, the land of the young, and had done some deed or misdeed in Aelin's lordship or in his family. It must have been an ill deed in truth, for it was in a very rage of revenge that Aelin came yearly at the permitted time to ravage Tara. 9 times he had come on this mission of revenge, but it is not to be supposed that he could actually destroy the holy city. The Ardri and magicians could prevent that, but he could yet do a damage so considerable that it was worth Conn's while to take special extra precautions against him, including the precaution of chance. Therefore, when the feast was over, then the banquet had commenced, the 100 fighter stood from his throne and looked over his assembled people. The chain of silence was shaken by the attendant whose duty and honor was the silver chain, and at that delicate chime the halt went silent, and a general wonder ensued as to what matter the High King would submit to his people. "Friends and heroes," said Conn, "Aelin the son of Midna will come tonight from Sleaford with a cold, terrible fire against our city. Is there among you one who loves Tara and the king, and who will undertake her defense against that being?" He spoke in silence, and when he had finished, he listened to the same silence, but it was now deep, ominous, agonized. Each man glanced uneasily at his neighbor, and then stared at his wine cup or his fingers. The hearts of young men went hot for a gallant moment, and were chilled in the succeeding one, for they had all heard of Aelin out of Shilfineki in the north. The lesser gentlemen looked under their brows at the greater champions, and these peered furtively at the greatest of all. Artog MacMorna of the hard strokes fell to biting his fingers. Conan the swearer and Gara MacMorna grumbled irritably to each other and at their neighbors. Even Caelty, the son of Ronan, looked down into his own lap, and Galmor sipped at his wine without any twinkle in his eye. A horrid embarrassment came into the great hall, and as the High King stood in that palpitating silence, his noble face changed from kindly to grave, and from that to a terrible sternness. In another moment, to the undying shame of every person present, he would have been compelled to lift his own challenge and declare himself the champion of Tara for that night, but the shame that was on the faces of his people would remain in the heart of their king. God's merry mind would help him to forget, but even his heart would be wrung by a memory that he would not dare to face. It was at that terrible moment that Fionn stood up. "What," said he, "will be given to the man who undertakes this defense?" "All that can be rightly asked will be royally bestowed," was the king's answer. "Who are the sureties?" said Fionn. "The kings of Ireland and the Red Kith, and with his magicians." "I will undertake the defense," said Fionn, and on that the kings and magicians who were present bound themselves to the fulfillment of the bargain. Fionn marched from the banqueting hall, and as he went, all who were present, of nobles and retainers and servants, acclaimed him and wished him luck. But in their hearts they were bidding him goodbye, for all were assured that the lad was marching to a death so unescapable that he might already be counted as a dead man. It is likely that Fionn looked for help to the people of the Shii themselves, for through his mother he belonged to the tribes of Dana, although on the father's side his blood was well compounded with mortal clay. It may be too that he knew how events would turn, for he had eaten the salmon of knowledge. Yet it is not recorded that on this occasion he invoked any magical art, as he did on other adventures. Fionn's way of discovering whatever was happening and hidden was always the same, and is many times referred to. A shallow, oblong dish of pure, pale gold was brought to him. This dish was filled with clear water. Then Fionn would bend his head and stare into the water, and as he stirred, he would place his thumb in his mouth under his tooth of knowledge, his wisdom tooth. Knowledge, may it be said, is higher than magic, and is more to be sought. It is quite possible to see what is happening and yet not know what is forward, for while seeing is believing, it does not follow that either seeing or believing is knowing. Many a person can see a thing, and believe a thing, and know just as little about it as the person who does neither. But Fionn would see and know, or he would understand the decent ratio of his visions. That he was versed in magic is true, for he was even known as the knowledgeable man, and later he had 2 magicians in his household named Durim and Macraith to do the rough work of knowledge for their busy master. It was not from the Sidhe, however, that assistance came to Fionn. End of chapter 12. Section 25 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, chapter 13. He marched through the successive fortifications until he came to the outer great wall, the boundary of the city, and when he had passed this, he was on the wide plain of Tara. Other than himself, no person was abroad, for on the night of the feast of Samhain, none but the madman would quit the shelter of a house, even if it were on fire. For whatever disasters might be within a house would be as nothing to the calamities without it. The noise of the banquet was not now audible to Fionn. It is possible, however, that there was a shamefaced silence in the great hall, and the lights of the city were hidden by the successive great ramparts. The sky was over him, the earth under him, and then these there were nothing. Or there was but the darkness and the wind. But darkness was not a thing to terrify him, bred in the nightness of a wood, and the very fosterling of gloom, nor could the wind afflict his ear or his heart. There was no note in its orchestra that he had not brooded on and become, which becoming is magic. The long-drawn moan of it, the thrilling whisper and hush, the shrill, sweet whistle, so thin it can scarcely be heard, and is taken more by the nerves than by the ear. The screech, sudden as a devil's yell, and loud as 10 thunders. The cry, as of one who flies with backward look to the shelter of leaves and darkness, and a sob, as of one stricken with an age-long misery, only at times remembered, but remembered then with what a pang. His ear knew by what successions they arrived, and by what stages they grew and diminished. Listening in the dark to the bundle of noises which make a noise, he could disentangle them and assign a place and a reason to each gradation of sound that formed the chorus. There was the patter of a rabbit, and there the scurrying of a hare. A bush rustled yonder, but that brief rustle was a bird, that pressure was a wolf, and this hesitation a fox. The scraping yonder was but a rough leaf against bark, and the scratching beyond it was a ferret's claw. Fear cannot be where knowledge is, and Fionn was not fearful. His mind, quietly busy on all sides, picked up one sound and dwelt on it. "A man," said Fionn, and he listened in that direction, back towards the city. A man it was, almost as skilled in darkness as Fionn himself. "This is no enemy," Fionn thought. "His walking is open." "Who comes?" he called. "A friend," said the newcomer. "Give a friend's name," said Fionn. "Feiquil Macona," was the answer. "Oh, my pulse and heart!" cried Fionn, and he strode a few paces to meet the great robber who had fostered him among the marshes. "So you are not afraid?" he said joyfully. "I am afraid in good truth," Feiquil whispered, "and the minute my business with you is finished, I will trot back as quick as legs will carry me. May the gods protect my going as they protected my coming," said the robber piously. "Amen," said Fionn. "And now tell me what you have come for." "Have you any plan against this Lord of the Shield?" Feiquil whispered. "I will attack him," said Fionn. "That is not a plan," the other groaned. "We do not plan to deliver an attack, but to win a victory." "Is this a very terrible person?" "Terrible indeed. No one can get near him or away from him. He comes out of the sheep playing sweet, low music on a timpan and a pipe, and all who hear this music fall asleep. I will not fall asleep, said Fionn. You will indeed, for everybody does. What happens then? Fionn asked. When all are asleep, Alan MacMidna blows a dart of fire out of his mouth, and everything that is touched by that fire is destroyed, and he can blow his fire to an incredible distance and to any direction. You are very brave to come to help me, Fionn murmured, especially when you are not able to help me at all. I can help, Fiaquil replied, but I must be paid. What payment? A third of all you earn and a seat at your council. I grant that, said Fionn, and now tell me your plan. You remember my spear with the 30 rivets of Arabian gold in its socket? The one, Fionn queried, that had its head wrapped in a blanket and was stuck in a bucket of water and was chained to a wall as well. The venomous Birga, that one. That one, Fiaquil replied. It is Alan MacMidna's own spear, he continued, and it was taken out of his sheath by your father. Well, said Fionn, wondering nevertheless where Fiaquil got this spear, but too generous to ask. When you hear the great man of the She come in, take the wrappings off the head of the spear, and bend your face over it. The head of the spear, the stench of it, all its pernicious and acrid qualities will prevent you from going to sleep. Are you sure of that? Said Fionn. You couldn't go to sleep close to that snatch, nobody could, Fiaquil replied decidedly. He continued, Alan MacMidna will be off his guard when he stops playing and begins to blow his fire. He will think everybody is asleep, then you can deliver the attack you were speaking of, and oh, good luck, go with it. I will give him back his spear, said Fionn. Here it is, said Fiaquil, taking the birga from under his cloak. But be as careful of it, my pulse, be as frightened of it as you are of the man of Dana. I will be frightened of nothing, said Fionn, and the only person I will be sorry for is that Alan MacMidna, who is going to get his own spear back. I will go away now, his companion whispered, for it is growing darker where you would have thought there was no more room for darkness, and there is an eerie feeling abroad which I do not like. That man from the She may come in a minute, and if I catch one sound of his music, I am done for. The robber went away, and again Fionn was alone. End of chapter 13. Section 26 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, chapter 14. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, chapter 14. He listened to the retreating footsteps until they could be heard no more, and the one sound that came to his tense ears was the beating of his own heart. Even the wind had ceased, and there seemed to be nothing in the world but the darkness and himself. In that gigantic blackness, in that unseen quietude and vacancy, the mind could cease to be personal to itself. It could be overwhelmed and merged in space, so that consciousness would be transformed or dissipated, and one might sleep standing. For the mind fears loneliness more than all else, and will escape to the moon rather than be driven inwards on its own being. But Fionn was not lonely, and he was not afraid when the son of Midna came. A long stretch of the silent night had gone by, minute following minute in a slow sequence, wherein as there was no change there was no time, wherein there was no past and no future, but a stupefying, endless present, which is almost the annihilation of consciousness. A change came then, for the clouds had also been moving, and the moon at last was sensed behind them, not as a radiance, but as a percolation of light, a gleam that was strained through matter after matter, and was less than the very wraith or remembrance of itself. A thing seen so narrowly, so sparsely, that the eye could doubt if it was or was not seeing, and might conceive that its own memory was recreating that which was still absent. But Fion's eye was the eye of a wild creature that spies on darkness and moves there wittingly. He saw then not a thing but a movement, something that was darker than the darkness it loomed on, not a being but a presence, and as it were impending pressure. And in a little he heard the deliberate pace of that great being. Fion bent to his spear and unloosed his coverings. Then from the darkness there came another sound, a low sweet sound, thrilling, joyous, thrillingly low, so low the ear could scarcely note it, so sweet the ear wished to catch nothing else and would strive to hear it rather than all sounds that may be heard by man. The music of another world, the unearthly, dear melody of the she. So sweet it was that the senses strained to it, and having reached must follow drowsily in its wake, and would merge in it, and could not return again to its own place until that strange harmony was finished, and the ear restored to freedom. But Fion had taken the covering from his spear, and with his brow pressed close to it, he kept his mind and all his senses engaged on that sizzling, murderous point. The music ceased, and Ailin hissed a fierce blue flame from his mouth, and it was as though he hissed lightning. Here it would seem that Fion used magic, for spreading out his fringed mantle he caught the flame. Rather he stopped it, for it slid from the mantle and sped down into the air to the depth of 26 spans, from which that slope is still called the glen of the mantle, and the rise on which Ailin stood is known as the Ard of Fire. One can imagine the surprise of Ailin MacMedna, seeing his fire caught and quenched by an invisible hand, and one can imagine that at this check he might be frightened. For who would be more terrified than a magician who sees his magic fail, and who, knowing of power, will guess at powers of which he has no conception and may well dread? Everything had been done by him as it should be done. His pipe had been played and his tympan. All who heard that music should be asleep, and yet his fire was caught in full course and was quenched. Ailin, with all the terrific strength of which he was master, blew again, and the great jet of blue flame came roaring and whistling from him and was caught and disappeared. Panic swelled into the man from Fairy. He turned from that terrible spot and fled, not knowing what might be behind, but dreading it as he had never before dreaded anything, and the unknown pursued him. That terrible defense became offense, and hung to his heel, and as a wolf pads by the flank of a bull. And Ailin was not in his own world. He was in the world of man, where movement is not easy, and the very air a burden. In his own sphere, in his own element, he might have outrun Fion, but this was Fion's world, Fion's element, and the flying god was not gross enough to outstrip him. Yet what a race he gave, for it was but at the entrance to his own she that the pursuer got close enough. Fion put a finger into the tongue of the great spear, and at that cast night fell on Ailin MacMedna. His eyes went black, his mind whirled and ceased. There came nothingness where he had been, and as the birga whistled into his shoulder blades, he withered away. He tumbled emptily and was dead. Fion took his lovely head from his shoulders and went back through the night to Tara. Triumphant Fion, who had dealt death to a god, and to whom death would be dealt, and who is now dead. He reached the palace at sunrise. On that morning all were astir early. They wished to see what destruction had been wrought by the great being, but it was the young Fion they saw, and that redoubtable head swinging by its hair. "What is your demand?" said the Audrey. "The thing that it is right I should ask." "The thing that it is right I should ask," said Fion. "The command of the Fianna of Ireland." "Make your choice," said Conn to Golmar. "You will leave Ireland, or you will place your hand in the hand of this champion and be his man." Gol could do a thing that would be hard for another person, and he could do it so beautifully that he was not diminished by any action. "Here is my hand," said Gol, and he twinkled at the stern young eyes that gazed on him as he made his submission. End of chapter 14. End of the boyhood of Fion.
Section 27 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Birth of Bran, Chapter 1. There are people who do not like dogs a bit. They are usually women. But in this story, there is a man who did not like dogs. In fact, he hated them. When he saw one, he used to go black in the face and he threw rocks at it until it got out of sight. But the power that protects all creatures had put a squint into this man's eye, so that he always threw crooked. This gentleman's name was Fergus Fionlaith, and his stronghold was near the harbour of Galway. Whenever a dog barked, he would leap out of his seat and he would throw everything that he owned out of the window in the direction of the bark. He gave prizes to servants who disliked dogs, and when he heard that a man had drowned a litter of pups, he used to visit that person and try to marry his daughter. Now Finn, the son of Yule, was the reverse of Fergus Fionlaith in this manner, for he delighted in dogs, and he knew everything about them from the setting of the first little white tooth to the rocking of the last long yellow one. He knew the affections and antipathies which are proper in a dog, the degree of obedience to which dogs may be trained without losing their honourable qualities or becoming servile and suspicious. He knew the hopes that animate them, the apprehensions which tingle in their blood, and all that is to be demanded from or forgiven in a paw, an ear, a nose, an eye, or a tooth. And he understands these things because he loved dogs, for it is by love alone that we understand anything. Among the 300 dogs which Finn owns, there were 2 to whom he gave an especial tenderness, and who were his daily and nightly companions. These 2 were Bran and Scarlorn. But if a person were to guess for 20 years, he would not find out why Finn loved these 2 dogs and why he would never be separated from them. Finn's mother, Myrna, went to wide Alan of Leinster to visit her son, and she brought her young sister, Tyrone, with her. The mother and aunt of the great captain were well treated among the Fianna, first because they were parents to Finn, and second because they were beautiful and noble women. No words can describe how delightful Myrna was. She took the branch, and as to Turner, a man could not look at her without becoming angry or dejected. Her face was fresh as a spring morning, her voice more cheerful than the cuckoo calling from the branch that is highest in the hedge, and her form swayed like a reed and flowed like a river, so that each person thought she would surely flow to him. Men who had wives of their own grew moody and downcast because they could not hope to marry her, while the bachelors of the Fianna stared at each other with truculent, bloodshot eyes, and they gazed on Turner so gently that she may have imagined she was being beamed on by the mild eyes of the dawn. It was to an Ulster gentleman, Yollan Actoch, that she gave her love, and this chief stated his rights and qualities and asked for her in marriage. Now Finn did not dislike the man of Ulster, but either he did not know them well, or else he knew them too well, for he made a curious stipulation before consenting to the marriage. He bound Yollan to return the lady if there should be occasion to think her unhappy, and Yollan agreed to do so. The sureties to this bargain were Coulter Mac Ronan, Gol Mac Morna, and Luaig. Luaig himself gave the bride away, but it was not a pleasant ceremony for him because he also was in love with the lady, and he would have preferred keeping her to giving her away. When she had gone, he made a poem about her, beginning, "There is no more light in the sky," and hundreds of sad people learned the poem by heart. End of Chapter 1. Section 28 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Birth of Bran, Chapter 2. When Yollan and Tyrone were married, they went to Ulster, and they lived together very happily. But the law of life is changed, nothing continues in the same way for any length of time. Happiness must become unhappiness, and will be succeeded again by the joy it has displaced. The past also must be reckoned with. It is seldom as far behind us as we could wish. It is more often in front, blocking the way, and the future trips over it just when we think that the road is clear and joy our own. Yollan had a past. He was not ashamed of it, he merely thought it was finished, although in truth it was only beginning, for it is that perpetual beginning of the past that we call the future. Before he joined the Fianna, he had been in love with a lady of the Sidhe named Uchtdéili, Fair Breast, and they had been sweethearts for years. How often he had visited his sweetheart in Fairy, with what eagerness and anticipation he had gone there. The lover's whistle that he used to give was known to every person in that Sidhe, and he had been discussed by more than one of the delicate sweet ladies of Fairy. "That is your whistle, Fairbreast," her sister of the Sidhe would say, and Uchtdéili would reply, Yes, that is my mortal, my lover, my pulse, and my one treasure. She laid her spinning aside, or her embroidery if she was at that, or if she were baking a cake of fine wheaten bread mixed with honey, she would leave the cake to bake itself and fly to Yolland. Then they went hand in hand in the country that smells of apple blossom and honey, looking on heavy-bowed trees and on dancing and beaming clouds. Or they stood dreaming together, locked in a clasping of arms and eyes, gazing up and down on each other, Yolland staring down into sweet grey wells that peeped and flickered under thin brows, and Ukdiali looking up into great black ones that went dreamy and went hot in endless alternation. Then Yolland would go back to the world of men, and Ukdiali would return to her occupations in the land of the ever-young. "What did he say?" her sister of the She would ask. "He said I was the berry of the mountain, the star of knowledge, and the blossom of the raspberry." "They always say the same thing," her sister pouted. "But they look other things," Ukdiali insisted. "They feel other things," she murmured, and an endless conversation recommenced. Then for some time Yolland did not come to Fairy, and Ukdiali marvelled at that, while her sister made 100 surmises, each one worse than the last. "He's not dead, or he would be here," she said. "He has forgotten you, my darling." News was brought to Tir Nanog of the marriage of Yolland and Chirin, and when Ukdiali heard that news her heart ceased to beat for a moment, and she closed her eyes. "Now," said her sister of the She, "that is how long the love of a mortal lasts," she added in the voice of sad triumph which is proper to sisters. But on Ukdiali there came a rage of jealousy and despair such as no person in the She had ever heard of, and from that moment she became capable of every ill deed, for there are two things not easily controlled, and they are hunger and jealousy. She determined that the woman who had supplanted her in Yolland's affections should rue the day she did it. She pondered and brooded revenge in her heart, sitting in thoughtful solitude and bitter collectedness until, at last, she had a plan. She understood the arts of magic and shape-changing, so she changed her shape into that of Finn's female runner, the best-known woman in Ireland. Then she set out from Fairy and appeared in the world. She travelled in the direction of Yolland's stronghold. Yolland knew the appearance of Finn's messenger, but he was surprised to see her. She saluted him. "Health and long life, my master." "Health and good days," he replied. "What brings you here, dear heart?" "I come from Finn." "And your message?" said he. "The royal captain intends to visit you." "He will be welcome," said Yolland. "We shall give him an Ulster feast." "The world knows what that is," said the messenger courteously. "And now," she continued, "I have messages for your queen." Tirin then walked from the house with the messenger, but when they had gone a short distance, Ukdiali drew a hazel rod from beneath her cloak and struck it on the queen's shoulder, and on the instant Tirin's figure trembled and quivered, and it began to whirl inwards and downwards, and she changed into the appearance of a hound. It was sad to see the beautiful slender dog standing shivering and astonished, and sad to see the lovely eyes that looked out pitifully in terror and amazement. But Ukdiali did not feel sad. She clasped a chain about the hound's neck, and they set off westward towards the house of Fergus Fionn VIII, who was reputed to be the unfriendliest man in the world to a dog. It was because of his reputation that Ukdiali was bringing the hound to him. She did not want a good home for this dog. She wanted the worst home that could be found in the world, and she thought that Fergus would revenge for her the rage and jealousy which she felt towards Tirin. End of Chapter 2. Section 29 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Birth of Bran, Chapter 3. As they paced along, Ukdiali railed bitterly against the hound, and shook and jerked her chain. Many a sharp cry the hound gave in that journey, many a mild lament. "Ah, supplanter, ah, taker of another girl's sweetheart," said Ukdiali fiercely. "How would your lover take it if he could see you now? How would he look if he saw your pointy ears, your long thin snout, your shivering skinny legs, and your long grey tail? He would not love you now, bad girl." "Have you heard of Fergus Fionn VIII?" she said again, "the man who does not like dogs?" Tirin had indeed heard of him. "It is to Fergus I shall bring you," cried Ukdiali. "He will throw stones at you. You have never had a stone thrown at you. Ah, bad girl, you do not know how a stone sounds as it nips the ear with a whirling buzz, nor how jagged and heavy it feels as it thumps against a skinny leg. Robber, mortal, bad girl, you have never been whipped, but you will be whipped now. You shall hear the song of the lash as it curls forward and bites inward and drags backwards. You shall dig up old bones stealthily at night and chew them against famine. You shall whine and squeal at the moon and shiver in the cold, and you will never take another girl's sweetheart again." And it was in those terms and in that tone that she spoke to Tyrion as they journeyed forward, so that the hound trembled and shrank and whined pitifully and in despair. They came to Fergus Fionlaith's stronghold, and Ukdiali demanded admittance. "Leave that dog outside," said the servant. "I will not do so," said the pretended messenger. "You can come in without the dog, or you can stay out with the dog," said the surly guardian. "By my hand," cried Ukdiali, "I will come in with this dog, or your master shall answer for it to Finn." At the name of Finn, the servant almost fell out of his standing. He flew to acquaint his master, and Fergus himself came to the great door of the stronghold. "By my faith," he cried in amazement, "it is a dog." "A dog it is," growled the glum servant. "Go you away," said Fergus to Ukdiali, "and when you have killed the dog, come back to me, and I will give you a present." "Life and health, my good master, from Finn, the son of Ual, the son of Baeskni," said she to Fergus. "Life and health back to Finn," he replied. "Come into the house and give your message, but leave the dog outside, for I don't like dogs." "The dog comes in," the messenger replied. "How is that?" cried Fergus angrily. "Finn sends you this hound to take care of until he comes for her," said the messenger. "I wonder at that," Fergus growled, for Finn knows well that there is not a man in the world has less of a liking for dogs than I have. "However that may be, master, I have given Finn's message, and here at my heel is the dog. Do you take her or refuse her?" "If I could refuse anything to Finn, it would be a dog," said Fergus, "but I could not refuse anything to Finn, so give me the hound." Ukdiali put the chain in his hand. "Ah, bad dog," said she. And then she went away, well satisfied with her revenge, and returned to her own people in the Sidhe. End of chapter 3. Section 30 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Birth of Bran, chapter 4. On the following day, Fergus called his servant. "Has that dog stopped shivering yet?" he asked. "It has not, sir," said the servant. "Bring the beast here," said his master, "for whoever else is dissatisfied, Finn must be satisfied." The dog was brought, and he examined it with a jaundiced and bitter eye. "It has the shivers indeed," he said. "The shivers it has," said the servant. "How do you cure the shivers?" his master demanded, for he thought that if the animal's legs dropped off, Finn would not be satisfied. "There is a way," said the servant doubtfully. "If there is a way, tell it to me," cried his master angrily. "If you were to take the beast up in your arms and hug it and kiss it, the shivers would stop," said the man. "Do you mean—" His master thundered, and he stretched his hand for a club. "I heard that," said the servant humbly. "Take that dog up," Fergus commanded, "and hug it and kiss it, and if I find a single shiver left in the beast, I'll break your head." The man bent to the hound, but it snapped a piece out of his hand and nearly bit his nose off as well. "That dog doesn't like me," said the man. "Nor do I," roared Fergus. "Get out of my sight." The man went away, and Fergus was left alone with the hound, but the poor creature was so terrified that it began to tremble 10 times worse than before. "Its legs will drop off," said Fergus. "Finn will blame me," he cried in despair. He walked to the hound. "If you snap at my nose, or if you put as much as the start of a tooth into the beginning of a finger," he growled. He picked up the dog, but it did not snap. It only trembled. He held it gingerly for a few moments. "If it has to be hugged," he said, "I'll hug it. I'd do more than that for Finn." He tucked and tightened the animal into his breast and marched moodily up and down the room. The dog's nose lay along his breast under his chin, and as he gave it dutiful hugs, 1 hug to every 5 paces, the dog put out its tongue and licked him timidly under the chin. "Stop!" roared Fergus. "Stop that forever!" And he grew very red in the face and stared truculently down along his nose. A soft brown eye looked up at him, and the shy tongue touched again on his chin. "If it has to be kissed," said Fergus gloomily, "I'll kiss it. I'd do more than that for Finn," he groaned. He bent his head, shut his eyes, and brought the dog's jaw against his lips, and at that the dog gave little wriggles in his arms, and little barks and little licks, so that he could scarcely hold her. He put the hound down at last. "There is not a single shiver left in her," he said. And that was true. Everywhere he walked, the dog followed him, giving little prances and little pats against him, and keeping her eyes fixed on his with such eagerness and intelligence that he marvelled. "That dog likes me," he murmured in amazement. "By my hand," he cried next day, "I like that dog." The day after that he was calling her my one treasure, my little branch, and within a week he could not bear her to be out of his sight for an instant. He was tormented by the idea that some evil person might throw a stone at the hound, so he assembled his servants and retainers and addressed them. He told them that the hound was the queen of creatures, the pulse of his heart and the apple of his eye, and he warned them that the person who as much as looked sideways on her or knocked one shiver out of her would answer for the deed with pains and indignities. He recited a list of calamities which would befall such a miscreant, and these woes began with flaying and ended with dismemberment, and had inside bits of such complicated and ingenious torment that the blood of the men who heard it ran chill in their veins, and the women of the household fainted where they stood. End of chapter 4. Section 31 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Birth of Bran, chapter 5. In course of time the news came to Finn that his mother's sister was not living with Yollan. He at once sent a messenger calling for fulfilment of the pledge that he had been given to the Fianna, and demanding the instant return of Tyrone. Yollan was in a sad condition when this demand was made. He guessed that Uachtaili had a hand in the disappearance of his queen, and he begged that time should be given him in which to find the lost girl. He promised if he could not discover her within a certain period that he would deliver his body into Finn's hands, and would abide by whatever judgment Finn might pronounce. The great captain agreed to that. "Tell the wife loser that I will have the girl or I will have his head," said Finn. Yollan set out then for Fairy. He knew the way, and in no great time he came to the hill where Uachtaili was. It was hard to get Uachtaili to meet him, but at last she consented, and they met under the apple boughs of Fairy. "Well," said Uachtaili. "Ah, breaker of vows and traitor to love," said she. "Hail and a blessing," said Yollan humbly. "By my hand," she cried, "I will give you no blessing, for it was no blessing you left with me when we parted." "I am in danger," said Yollan. "What is that to me?" she replied fiercely. "Finn may claim my head," he murmured. "Let him claim what he can take," said she. "No," said Yollan proudly, "he will claim what I can give." "Tell me your tale," she said coldly. Yollan told his story then, and, he concluded, "I'm certain that you have hidden the girl." "If I save your head from Finn," the woman of the She replied, "then your head will belong to me." "That is true," said Yollan. "And if your head is mine, the body that goes under it is mine. Do you agree to that?" "I do," said Yollan. "Give me your pledge," said Uachtaili, "that if I save you from this danger, you will keep me as your sweetheart until the end of life and time." "I give that pledge," said Yollan. Uachtaili went then to the house of Fergus Fionn Liath, and she broke the enchantment that was on the hound, so that Tyrone's own shape came back to her. But in the matter of 2 small whelps to which the hound had given birth, the enchantment could not be broken, so they had to remain as they were. These 2 whelps were Bran and Skylorn. They were sent to Finn, and he loved them forever after, for they were loyal and affectionate as only dogs can be, and they were as intelligent as human beings. Besides that, they were Finn's own cousins. Tyrone was then asked in marriage by Lua, who had loved her so long. He had to prove to her that he was not any other woman's sweetheart, and when he proved that, they were married, and they lived happily ever after, which is the proper way to live. He wrote a poem beginning, "Lovely the day, dear is the eye of the dawn," and 1,000 merry people learned it after him. But as to Fergus Fionn Liath, he took to his bed, and he stayed there for a year and a day, suffering from blighted affection, and he would have died in the bed only that Finn sent him a special pup, and in a week that young hound became the star of fortune and the very pulse of his heart, so that he got well again, and he also lived happily ever after. End of chapter 5. End of The Birth of Bran.
Section 32 of Irish Fairy Tales. Oisin's Mother, Chapter 1. Evening was drawing nigh, and the Fianna Finn had decided to hunt no more that day. The hounds were whistled to heel, and a sober homeward march began. For men will walk soberly in the evening, however they go out in the day, and dogs will take the mood from their masters. they were pacing so through the golden-shafted, tender-colored eve when a fawn leaped suddenly from covert, and with that leap all quietness vanished. The men shouted, the dogs gave tongue, and a furious chase commenced. Fionn loved a chase at any hour, and with Bran and Scialan he outstripped the men and dogs of his troop, until nothing remained in the limpid world but Fionn, the two hounds, and the nimble, beautiful fawn. These and the occasional boulders round which they raced, or over which they scrambled. The solitary tree which dozed aloof and beautiful in the path, the occasional clump of trees that hived sweet shadow as a hive hoards honey, and the rustling grass that stretched to infinity, and that moved and crept and swung under the breeze in endless rhythmic billowings. In his wildest moment, Fionn was thoughtful, and now, although running hard, he was thoughtful. There was no movement of his beloved hounds that he did not know, not a twitch or fling of the head, not a cock of the ears or tail that was not significant to him. But on this chase, whatever signs the dogs gave were not understood by their master. He had never seen them in such eager flight. They were almost utterly absorbed in it, but they did not whine with eagerness, nor did they cast any glance toward him for the encouraging word which he never failed to give when they sought it. They did look at him, but it was a look which he could not comprehend. There was a question and a statement in those deep eyes, and he could not understand what that question might be, nor what it was they sought to convey. Now and again, one of the dogs turned ahead in full flight and stared, not at Fionn, but distantly backwards over the spreading and swelling plain where their companions of the hunt had disappeared. They are looking for the other hounds, said Fionn, and yet they do not give tongue. Tongue it, Avran, he shouted. Bell it out, Ahiolan. It was then they looked at him, the look which he could not understand and had never seen on a chase. They did not tongue it, nor bell it, but they added silence to silence and speed to speed, until the lean grey bodies were one pucker and lashing of movement. Fionn marvelled. They do not want the other dogs to hear or to come on this chase, he murmured, and he wondered what might be passing within those slender heads. The fawn runs well, his thought continued. What is it, Avran, my heart? After her, Ahiolan. Hist and away, my loves. There is going and to spare in that beast yet, his mind went on. She is not stretched to the full, nor half stretched. She may outrun even Bran, he thought ragingly. They were racing through a smooth valley in a steady, beautiful, speedy flight, when suddenly the fawn stopped and lay on the grass, and it lay with the calm of an animal that has no fear, and the leisure of one that is not pressed. Here is a change, said Fionn, staring in astonishment. She is not winded, he said. What is she lying down for? But Bran and Scialan did not stop. They added another inch to their long-stretched, easy bodies and came up on the fawn. It is an easy kill, said Fionn regretfully. They have her, he cried. But he was again astonished, for the dogs did not kill. They leaped and played about the fawn, licking its face and rubbing delighted noses against its neck. Fionn came up then. His long spear was lowered in his fist at the thrust, and his sharp knife was in its sheath, but he did not use them, for the fawn and the two hounds began to play round him, and the fawn was as affectionate towards him as the hounds were. so that when a velvet nose was thrust in his palm, it was as often a fawn's muzzle as a hound's. In that joyous company he came to wide Allen of Leinster, where the people were surprised to see the hounds and the fawn and the chief and none of the other hunters that had set out with them. When the others reached home, the chief told of his chase, and it was agreed that such a fawn must not be killed, but that it should be kept and well treated, and that it should be the pet fawn of the Fianna. But some of those who remembered Bra's parentage thought that as Bran herself had come from the Sidhe, so this fawn might have come out of the Sidhe also. End of chapter 1.